Good afternoon and welcome to our first webinar of this series, Letter of Interest Submission and Project Selection. This webinar applies to all prospective borrowers. If your colleagues are interested in this series, we'll have more information about the 3 upcoming webinars at the end of this presentation. My name is Arielle Gerstein and I'm a project manager with the WIFIA program. I'm going to be your monitor for today's webinar. Now we're going to put 4 questions on your screen for about 30 seconds each to gather more information about who's in our audience. All right, thanks so much for your feedback. So we encourage you to write in questions throughout our presentation by typing into the question area of the GoToWebinar dashboard. Questions may be posed at any time. So all participants are muted on the webinar and can only communicate by typing. We will answer as many questions as possible in the time allotted. If we don't get to your question during the presentation, we'll follow up with you directly in the next week or so. Okay, so for the purpose of this session, we're hosting this webinar series to help prospective borrowers learn more about how to submit a WIFIA letter of interest and how EPA will select projects this funding round. These webinars allow us to interact with prospective borrowers and water industry and finance professionals from across the country. And ultimately, we hope that these webinars will pave the way for successful letters of interest in this funding round and future funding rounds. So for the agenda, I'm going to go over the first part, the program overview. I'm joined by two colleagues. Danusha Chandy will go over the letter of interest and tips for completing it. She's a senior engineer in the WIFIA program. Before joining EPA, she managed a variety of infrastructure, water infrastructure, and environmental projects as an engineering consultant and public utility employee. I'm also joined by Karen Fligger, who will discuss the letter of interest evaluation. Karen is a senior program manager for the WIFIA program. Over her 12-year career at EPA, she has worked on the Clean Watersheds Needs Survey, the WaterSense program, and other infrastructure-related projects. So if you have any questions after the webinar, feel free to contact us at our email, wifia@epa.gov. Our website also has many helpful resources that we'll be going over in more detail later to learn more about the program and submitting a letter of interest, including an updated letter of interest template, FAQs, a letter of interest checklist, a sample letter of interest, and our updated program handbook. So before my colleagues go into the letter of interest specifics, I want to provide a brief introduction to the WIFIA program. So a little background, our program was established in 2014 in the Water Resources Reform and Development Act. It was modeled after a similar successful program at the Department of Transportation called WIFIA. Between 2014 and late 2016, EPA took the necessary steps to establish a federal credit program at the agency and develop the administrative framework to make loans. Last month, in March, Congress appropriated $55 million for credit subsidy for fiscal year 2018, which allowed us to open our second selection round on April 12th. WIFIA is a federal credit program which allows it to leverage federal appropriation. Congress only needs to appropriate money to cover estimated losses, and the remainder of the funding is borrowed from and repaid to Treasury. Because the water industry has a low risk profile, the congressional appropriation can support a much larger amount of infrastructure investment. This concept will be explained in more detail later in the presentation. So our mission is to accelerate investment in our nation's water and wastewater infrastructure by providing long-term, low-cost supplemental credit assistance under customized terms to credit-worthy wastewater and water projects of national and regional significance. So before we talk about the tips for submitting the letter of interest, or as we call it for short, the LOI, we want to make sure everyone understands the general application process and specifically more about project selection. So for WIFIA, we divide the application process into three major areas. The first one is project selection, which is the focus of today's webinar, and it's also the first step. It includes the announcement of funding, prospective borrowers submitting a letter of interest, and EPA selecting and announcing projects that it would like to submit an application. Project approval, the second step, kicks off when the invited prospective borrower submits its application and ends when the applicant and the EPA administrator sign the term sheet. The third stage, negotiation and closing, includes developing the term sheet into a credit agreement and signing it at closing. So this is just a timeline of project selection. The dates provided in the graphic show the schedule that we will follow for the FY 2018 selection round. So as I mentioned, the NOFA or Notice of Funding Availability, was announced on April 12th, 2018. So prospective borrowers have about 90 days to submit a letter of interest. So it's due on July 6, 2018. We're anticipating a review period of 3 to 4 months. This is dependent on the number of letters of interest we receive. And EPA will publicly announce the selected projects in the fall of 2018. The selected projects will be given about a week notice of their selection. So project selection is a competitive process to identify projects to invite to apply, which are eligible, creditworthy, feasible, and help EPA and the WIFIA program to meet its mission. For eligibility, we confirm that the borrower, project type, and project size are all eligible. The first step in the project selection is understanding the notice of funding availability. So as I mentioned, the process is kicked off by EPA publishing the Notice of Funding Availability, or the NOFA, in the Federal Register. The NOFA is a really important document because it provides key information specific to the funding round, and I recommend that if you are thinking about submitting a letter of interest, that you take a look at it. So it includes how much money is available. So as I mentioned, $55 million appropriation we received in March, and we estimate that we will be able to make about $5.5 billion in loans. And because WIFIA can only fund 49% of the project costs, the total infrastructure investment would total $11 billion. Once again, the opening date was April 12th, and the closing date is July 6, 2018. The NOFA also includes key information on evaluation processes, such as the weights of the selection criteria. The 2018 priorities for this round are to provide for clean and safe drinking water, and repair, rehabilitate, and replace aging infrastructure and conveyance systems. The NOFA also includes instructions for submitting a letter of interest. All right, so before deciding to submit a letter of interest, it's important to make sure that you're an eligible borrower and your project is eligible. Borrowers include state, local, and tribal governments, private entities, partnerships, state clean water and drinking water, SRF, or state revolving fund programs. So basically everyone is eligible except individuals. EPA is able to provide credit assistance to a variety of projects, including clean water SRF and drinking water SRF, enhanced energy efficiency projects at drinking water and wastewater facilities, projects for repair, rehabilitation, or replacement, desalination, aquifer recharge, alternative water supply and recycling projects, drought prevention, reduction, or mitigation projects, acquisition of property if it is integral to or will mitigate the environmental impacts of an eligible project, and a combination of eligible projects secured by a common security pledge, which will be discussed in more detail later. You should also keep in mind that we can accept a written description of the project and let you know whether it's eligible at any time. All right, so costs which can be included in a WIFIA loan for sizing and reimbursement includes most costs you'd think of as associated with a typical water infrastructure project. These include planning, design, and construction costs. It also includes costs for the acquisition of property related to water projects, including easement rights, capitalized interest, and application and credit processing fees. There are some costs that are not eligible, including costs associated with getting rating letters. So the project and the prospective borrower must be creditworthy and demonstrate this in the letter of interest. Projects must cost no less than $20 million for small communities defined as populations with less than 25,000 people. The minimum is $5 million for SRF eligible projects. Project financing shall be repayable from a dedicated revenue source that also need to secure the senior project obligations. Public sponsorship of private projects must be demonstrated with a certified letter, executed local ordinance, or some other measure. Lastly, the prospective borrower must have developed an operations and maintenance plan that identified adequate revenue to operate, maintain, and repair the project during its useful life. So this is just a short list of some of the more relevant federal requirements projects must comply with to receive WIFIA funding. As you can see, you might be familiar with some of these: American Iron and Steel, NEPA, things like that. You can find a comprehensive list in the WIFIA program handbook. So as mentioned before, a project can only receive up to 49% of eligible project costs from WIFIA credit assistance. A borrower may either receive a direct loan, in which a loan is disbursed by and repaid to the federal government, or a loan guarantee, which is a pledge to pay all or part of the principal and accrued interest on a loan or other debt obligation issued by a borrower and funded by a lender. All right, so now we're going to talk about the second stage of project selection, the letter of interest submission. So EPA will assess the eligibility of the prospective borrower and project, perform a preliminary creditworthiness assessment, an engineering feasibility analysis, and evaluate the project against selection criteria as part of the project selection. And again, I recommend that you look at the NOFA to find out more about this process. So the deadline to submit the letter of interest, as mentioned before, is July 6th. It's at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Prospective borrowers can submit all letters of interest and attachments to the WIFIA's email box or to our SharePoint site. And if you are submitting a lot of attachments and it would be a large number of files, we recommend that you do request access to our SharePoint site. Prospective borrowers should send an email to WIFIA requesting access to SharePoint to upload documents, and request to access SharePoint should be made no later than 12 p.m. Eastern Time on July 3rd. And you will, as a prospective borrower, receive a confirmation email upon submitting a letter of interest. So this is where you can find our letter of interest form. You can go to our website under application materials to find our FY 2018 letter of interest form, along with other letter of interest resources. So if you submitted a letter of interest the last round, then this form is a little different. The new form is an editable Word document and has been updated to take into account changes in the NOFA. The LOI should not exceed 50 pages, but you can submit draft or final supporting documents as attachments. Signature pages need to have original signatures, so they need to be scanned. So just going to talk a minute about fees. So for the letter of interest submittal, there are no fees. Once a prospective borrower is invited to apply, there is a $100,000 application fee, $25,000 for communities of not more than 25,000 people. EPA does require reimbursement if you were to become a selected project for engineering, financial, and legal advisors at the application stage. This fee ranges between $250,000 to $500,000 depending on project complexity. Fees may be part of your credit assistance, not including finances solely related to obtaining WIFIA credit assistance. So this is the end of the project selection overview, and now I will turn it over to Danusha to start our letter of interest overview and tips.
Thanks, Arielle. All right. So I'm going to go over some tips for success when putting together a letter of interest this round. So pay attention and feel free to send in your questions as I go along if you need any further clarification. Okay, first, some general tips to keep in mind for the entire LOI. First, this may seem basic, but everyone should read the instructions, especially because we have a new form in the NOFA and the program handbook. You'll find specifics on the selection scoring in the NOFA and guidance for each section in the handbook. Please answer every question and provide supporting materials to support your answer. You can also refer us to various publications, studies, and attachments rather than rewriting descriptions of answers to your questions. It's also really helpful if you can provide supporting documents when available and provide specific references in your response when pointing to those documents. So if you want us to look at a preliminary engineering report, tell us which section to go to if it's in response to a particular answer. Preliminary or draft documents are also okay to include as supporting materials. Remember, we are probably learning about your system and project for the first time, so please be very specific in your descriptions and explanations. Do not assume we will just get it. Our evaluations have to be based on your submittals, so the more thorough you are, the better. I know we're juggling a lot every day, but it really is best to submit as early as you can, even if it's by a day or two, in order to avoid issues with uploading large files at the last minute. The deadline is non-negotiable. Okay, so Section A is the first section in the letter of interest form, and for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. Here you basically tell us who you are, the organizational structure or management plan for the project, and what type of eligible entity you are. And if you are a private entity, you must provide evidence of public sponsorship. This needs to be stronger than a simple statement asserting this. It can be a board resolution, an agreement with the community, or something else like that. Note that the updated form asks when you would be ready to submit an application if your LOI is selected in this round. Okay, the project plan section is where you get to tell us all about your project. Question 4 asks for a project description, and we're really looking for a concise and accurate description of your project here. Some of the specifics you should note include whether it's a rehab or replacement or a new construction project, what type of project it is, and the major scope items. It would be great if you would consider this as your elevator speech for the project. We use this description a lot during our review process. Question 5 asks for the project purpose, and what we are looking for here is the project need and benefits. We've listed some examples here, but there's obviously many more that you can come up with. Here we have an example of a brief description and purpose that also tells the reader exactly what the project is about and why it is being proposed. And I think Arielle mentioned, we do have a sample letter of interest available on our website. So if you're looking for more examples as we go along, that is available on the website. Okay. With the rest of Section B, what you should keep in mind while preparing an LOI is that we need enough information to be able to evaluate the technical feasibility of the project at its current stage. If you have planning documents prepared for the project, such as preliminary engineering reports or planning documents, please submit those as an attachment. We can generally get a lot of scope, plan, schedule, and cost details from those kinds of documents. If you aren't submitting a planning report, please make sure that the detailed description in Section B includes size, capacity, major components, material descriptions, etc. Think about what someone new to the project would need to evaluate whether your project scope, cost, and schedule are reasonable. And when you are submitting attachments, it's best for our review if you submit the whole document and identify what section or page you want us to focus on in your LOI response. We had the situation where we had received brief extracts of reports, which got a little confusing to go through after a little bit of time. One of the optional attachments to the LOI are system master plans, facility plans, or asset management plans. If you have an overarching system level planning document and can submit it, it's very helpful. We use these plans to support a need for a project and evaluate that the project is being implemented in a well thought out manner with regards to your system needs. Question 10 asks you to specify your project delivery method. If your project includes an alternative project delivery method, such as design build, we ask that you tell us so here. Some borrowers last time told us where in the procurement process they were and who the selected contractors were, which also made it easier to assess certain risks. A WIFIA loan can consist of multiple related projects, but we'd like you to provide cost, scope, and schedule information for each project. Try to refrain from providing typical or to be determined project details. It's better to have actual information for our review. Keep in mind that in general, all the projects should achieve substantial completion about 5 years after loan closing, and all the projects should serve a common purpose. If you have a program of projects or a group of projects that you'd like to apply under one LOI, feel free to reach out to us if you need further clarification. WIFIA is also set up to enable new and innovative approaches. However, during the LOI review, we are tasked with evaluating the risks of such projects. If you have any kind of risk assessment or matrix developed, these can be helpful for the assessment. It's also great to be able to see that you've thought through risks in any case. The schedule is a very important part of our review. Please include major planning, permitting, environmental review, design, and construction start and end dates. One of the other things we try to assess is whether WIFIA funding would speed up your schedule. So if WIFIA funding would allow you to move up any of your scheduled dates, please let us know. We look to see if complying with federal cross-cutters would be a significant burden on your schedule. I know that your existing project schedules may not include federal crosscutters like NEPA, but it would be great in your LOI response if you could let us know what you think the NEPA, Fish and Wildlife, and National Historic Preservation Act implications would be for your schedule. We do have resources in the handbook that help you figure out some of these implications. Some borrowers let us know that regardless of the schedule implications, they were okay with some delays because of compliance factors, which was helpful in our review. And that takes us to the environmental review response. When you're telling us your environmental review plan, we are looking for existing permits and reviews you need to do and what you think your federal cross-cutter compliance plan is. If you think that the project could be eligible for a categorical exclusion under NEPA, please note that. We ultimately make the determination, but your take is useful. If your project is already undergoing similar environmental reviews through an SRF or Army Corps permit, please note that. It tells us a lot about how your project is already dealing with crosscutters. And lastly, if you have any environmental analysis or documents like an EA or an EIS, please submit those as attachments. Okay, on to Section C, the Operation and Maintenance Plan. The WIFIA statute requires an O&M plan for every WIFIA-funded project. We understand that comprehensive plans are not typical during planning and early design stages. Instead, you can provide us an explanation of major topics to be included in the final plan or a table of contents. You could also provide a description of your experience with similar technology on another facility. We also need to know the estimated useful life of the major assets included in the project. And if you have any life cycle costs or assessments, please submit those as attachments. Okay, so Section D is the financing plan. This part of the LOI form has been updated to make sure you take a look at the most recent version of the form online. In your responses to questions in Section D, please remember that we should have a really good idea of how much you want from a WIFIA loan, what the total project costs are, and how you plan to finance the non-WIFIA portion of the project. Previously incurred costs can be used for project sizing purposes and towards eligible costs. It's helpful if you can note in your response which costs have already been incurred. So in the form, we ask you to provide us with detailed sources and uses, and they're broken down into specific sections. However, if you do have detailed construction costs estimates available, we ask that you submit those as well as an attachment so that we can assess the reasonableness of the costs. It's pretty difficult to assess whether a project cost estimate is adequate without a more detailed estimate like one that would be available in a planning or scoping report. Starting at question 4, we ask that you describe the plan of finance. This should include the proposed credit structure, including whether the total debt for the project will be issued under a new or existing indenture, and what WIFIA's lien position would be. The revenue pledge, which is the source of funds from which you intend to pay back the WIFIA loan, should be clear. You should describe the long-term revenue projections or the financial condition of the issuer of a general obligation pledge as appropriate. You can also propose credit enhancements to complement the source of revenue, such as a general obligation pledge to backstop rate revenues. When you're putting together the financial plan, you may need to make some assumptions for planning purposes. Part of our creditworthiness assessment includes identifying whether your assumptions are realistic. So please make sure to provide consistent, transparent, and realistic assumptions across the LOI. If you have a credit rating, it's very helpful to provide it as a supporting document. When we evaluate your creditworthiness, We are also looking at your proposed capital structure and historical and projected debt coverage ratios, liquidity, and leverage. Make sure the information you provide in the pro forma matches what you're pledging. And again, please answer all the questions and contact us if you need any clarification on what we are asking in the LOI. Question 8 asks you to attach a financial pro forma, which presents key revenue, expense, and debt repayment assumptions for the revenue pledged to repay the WIFIA loan, including up to 3 years of historical data as available. So if you are a public utility pledging system revenues, the pro forma should provide details at the system level. If your revenue pledge consists of revenues generated from the proposed WIFIA project, the pro forma would include project level numbers. The pro forma should be uploaded as an editable Microsoft Excel workbook and not in PDF or values format. The pro forma focuses on 4 key components: operating performance, cash available for capital expenditures and other obligations, debt service coverage, and the capital structure. We do have a sample pro forma available on our website, which you feel free to take a look at. Okay. Section E, Karen is going to spend a lot of time going through each of the selection criteria in a little bit, but some general tips to keep in mind when you're putting your responses together include focusing on how the WIFIA project relates to each criteria when writing your responses. We've had responses in the past which include references to larger utility level efforts as opposed to project specific, which is not what we're looking for. Each response should generally be about 1 to 3 paragraphs in length. That's what we found was the sweet spot between giving us enough information to really figure out if the project addresses the selection criteria and not too long. The program handbook describes the key criteria we use in our evaluation. Section F is pretty straightforward, but please make sure to include 1 staff person that is readily accessible in case we need to follow up with you on anything quickly. If you need to, you can add a 3rd contact as necessary. For sections G and H, make sure to read and sign all the signature locations. In section H, if you do not want your LOI materials shared with your SRF program, please initial where noted. Okay, and I'm going to hand it to Karen to talk a little bit more about the LOI evaluation process.
Thanks, Danusha. I'm going to talk now about how your submitted letter of interest is evaluated by EPA. I'm just going to take a second to remind you that you can write in questions you have for us at any time, and at the end of my presentation, we'll start going through the Q&A that's been received. Following the letter of interest submission deadline, so July 6th, staff from the WIFIA program and other parts of the Office of Water will evaluate letters of interest to determine eligibility, preliminary engineering feasibility, preliminary creditworthiness, and alignment with EPA's priorities and mission. The first step of this is an eligibility screen. So at that point, we check 3 main things regarding eligibility. So first, we check to see if the entity applying is an eligible entity. And if it is a private entity that is eligible, we check to make sure that there's a clear demonstration of public sponsorship. Second, we make sure that the project is an eligible project. And then third, we just make sure that the costs are eligible at the high level. So we make sure that the anticipated project costs are $20 million or more for most communities, or $5 million or more for small communities, which we consider to be 25,000 people or less. If a prospective borrower or its project is found to be ineligible, we will notify the point of contact immediately. Only eligible letters of interest will move on in the process. As mentioned earlier, EPA announced 2 priorities for its 2018 selection round. repairing, rehabilitating, and replacing aging infrastructure and conveyance systems, and providing for clean and safe drinking water. In talking about the safe drinking water component, it's focused on reducing exposure to lead in our nation's drinking water systems, ensuring continuous and compliance with contaminant limits, and responding quickly to emerging concerns. So you'll see these two priorities reflected in the weights in the evaluation process. The WIFIA selection criteria are divided into three categories. The first is project impact, and that really focuses on how does the project help the WIFIA program meet its programmatic mission, EPA's mission, and address the priorities that were set by EPA for this round. The second area is project readiness, and this includes engineering feasibility and readiness to proceed. And the third is borrower creditworthiness. And this really focuses on the probability that the borrower can repay the federal government, as well as the amount of subsidy needed to finance the project. Each criterion within a category can provide a range of points, and the maximum number of points is indicated in the NOFA, and I'll show you a table with that information on the next slide. Each category, each of the three categories that I listed, can provide up to 100 points out of a total of 300 available points. So at the end of our evaluation, we will calculate a score for each project, and the highest possible score that you could receive is 300 points. So this slide shows you how the various aspects of the selection criteria are weighted by showing the maximum points available for each component. So now I'm going to walk through each of these criteria and explain what we would be looking for in our review. Additional information on this is provided in an appendix in our program handbook. And just in case you want to reference, as I'm walking through the slides, I've also added that maximum point value at the end of the title of each slide, just so you can refer to it. So I'm going to begin with project impact criteria. For project impact in particular, this is really your chance to present your project in a way that demonstrates how it aligns with our goals. So I want to remind people, when you're responding to the selection criteria in your letter of interest, you should write about the project for an audience that's unfamiliar with it. So you can reference other materials, you can reference attachments in your responses, but just kind of keep in mind that the people reviewing it know very little to nothing about your project until they read your responses. All right, so the first criterion is regional or national significance with respect to economic or public benefit. And while we're reviewing this, we want you to respond to these kind of key questions. So what element of the project provides economic or public benefits, and what are those benefits? How does the project or components of the project benefit regions which are not directly served by the project? And how the project or components of the project can benefit the economy or the public on an even broader level, so across multiple states or nationwide. So basically, we're going to be looking at both the types of benefits that are a result of this project and the scale of those benefits in terms of geography. And also we would, when possible, we would like to see those benefits quantified. The next criterion is newer innovative approaches, and it really focuses on the project's technology. So does it have newer innovative technology, for example, energy efficiency components? Is it a desalination or a water recycling project? In responding to this criterion, you should really address the following types of questions. So does the project incorporate any new or innovative approaches or technologies? Has that technology been pilot tested? Has it been implemented at a full-scale level? And any of the approaches or technologies that you're including have the potential to significantly improve standard operations within the water and wastewater industry. The next selection criteria has two parts. The first part is the extent to which the project protects against extreme weather events, such as floods or hurricanes. And the second part is the extent to which it helps to maintain or protect the environment. To explain how your project relates to these, please provide the following information to us. So can you answer these types of questions? Does the project address extreme weather events that have occurred in the past? Or does the project address things that you expect to occur in the next 20 years? How will you meet state and federal standards for flood risk or floodplain management? And sort of more broadly, how does the project help improve or maintain the environment? The fourth criterion is the extent to which a project serves region with significant energy exploration, development, or production areas. And this criterion will simply be scored on whether or not the project serves a population in an area with energy development, exploration, or production. The fifth criterion is the extent to which a project serves regions with significant water resource challenges, including the need to address water quality concerns in areas of regional, national, or international significance, water quantity concerns, water resource challenges that have already been identified in regional, state, or multi-state agreements, and water resources with exceptional recreational value or ecological importance. In responding, it's helpful if you can tell us how the project addresses a water resource challenge, how much of the challenge is expected to be alleviated by your project, how does the water resource challenge affect your ability to serve your customers or maintain and improve service levels or pose a significant risk to human health or life, and what % of the total project cost addresses the water resource challenge that you've identified. The next criterion, number 6, is the extent to which the project addresses identified municipal, state, or regional priorities. This can include implementing projects in regional planning documents, meeting existing or impending regulatory requirements, or keeping a high-quality resource from deteriorating. For criteria 7, the extent to which the project addresses needs for repair, rehabilitation, or replacement of water infrastructure, we look at the percentage of project costs that are for repairing, replacing, or rehabilitating the existing assets or an existing system. For criterion 8, the extent to which the project serves economically stressed communities or pockets of economically stressed ratepayers within otherwise non-economically stressed communities, we look at what portion of the community is considered economically stressed. We encourage you to make your case to us about your community's economic status, and it can be made to us in a number of ways. So you can use data from the census like median household income or poverty rates. You can also use other metrics that are used in your state. But in any case, please cite the data you're using. And if it is a metric like a state designation, so like a state designation for a state designation for your community, please kind of explain what that means and how a community receives that designation. We've added a new criterion for 2008 that aligns with our priorities for this round, and it is the extent to which the project reduces exposure to lead in the nation's drinking water systems or ensures continuous compliance with contaminant limits. So this will be scored based on the percentage of the project costs that addresses compliance with contaminant limits in drinking water. So now I'll discuss the project readiness criteria, which are reviewed by our engineering team. So half of the points in this group will be given based on our assessment on the readiness of the project to proceed towards development. We base this on how quickly the contracting can commence following the loan's term sheet approval and the obligation of funds for the loan. To evaluate this, we look at the proposed schedule. We evaluate issues that may affect the development or financing of the project, such as community support, pending legislation, permitting, or litigation, and the projected development schedule for procurement documents. The other half is based on the preliminary engineering feasibility analysis. The engineering team will evaluate the proposed project's design, operating, and engineering plans to verify that the project is using appropriate technology, that it is technically feasible based on detailed engineering information, that it has a reasonable operation and maintenance plan for the full length of the proposed loan, and that the federal government is protected from completion risk. Finally, we look at the borrower's creditworthiness. As was mentioned earlier, the borrower and the project must be creditworthy to receive a WIFIA loan. Our credit team reviews these criteria. The first criterion is the likelihood that the WIFIA loan would enable the project to proceed at an earlier date than the project would otherwise be able to proceed. So what impact does receiving a WIFIA loan have on the project schedule or the schedule of other projects in your system? The next criterion is the extent to which the project financing plan includes public or private financing in addition to the WIFIA loan. As we mentioned earlier, the WIFIA loan can provide up to 49% of the anticipated project costs. So for this, you should identify the sources of funding for the other portion of the project costs and the certainty of obtaining that funding. And if one of your funding sources is uncertain, it's helpful if you indicate what your plan B is if that funding ends up not being available for the project. The next criterion is the reduction of federal assistance. And basically, we want you to indicate whether the WIFIA funding increases or decreases the contribution of federal assistance to the project. We realize that in almost all projects, they will not have federal funding before coming to WIFIA, and so that the WIFIA loan is very likely to increase the amount of federal funding in the project. The next criterion in this area is the use of budget authority. So this is something that we don't ask you to respond to, but this is an analysis that we do. So to determine the use of budget authority, we will do an assessment on the amount of our budget authority. So how much of that $55 million that we received as an appropriation this year is required to fund your loan. And we'll look at it both in terms of a percentage and in terms of dollars. And so that percentage will allow us to compare projects and that serves as an indicator of how risky your project is. And then the dollar amount allows us to budget our $55 million appropriation when we're making our decisions. And finally, the preliminary creditworthy assessment is our evaluation of the reasonable assurance that you'll repay the government. So in it, we consider the financial strength of your organization, business and economic considerations, management, and loan-specific factors. And that helps us determine the creditworthiness of the entity that is submitting a letter of interest and of the project. Once the staff has completed its evaluation of the eligible projects, the scores will be added up for each project to determine a final score. And as I said before, that final score will be out of a possible total of 300 points. The selection committee, who's made up of senior managers within the Office of Water at EPA, will ultimately will select who is invited to apply. And the projects will be selected in order of score. However, we do have a statutory requirement that requires us to have a diversity of both project type and geographic location within our portfolio. So we will factor that in selecting projects. So we will provide written responses to everyone who submits a letter of interest. So we will provide written responses to both those who are invited to apply and those who are not selected. If you were not selected, you may request a debrief. We did this for the 2017 selection round, and we found these conversations to be very useful. So we encourage you to participate if you are not selected. So I just want to point out that our website really does have a lot of great resources. We learned a lot between the 2017 from the 2017 selection round, and as a result, we put together some additional resources that we think will be helpful. We do have a letter of interest form. It was, as Arielle mentioned, updated in April to incorporate changes to the selection criteria. We really encourage you to use this form to develop your letter of interest. We designed it as a Word document to make it easier for both you and as you're preparing your letter of interest and for us in the review phase. We think it incorporates a lot of things we learned in 2017 and reflects it does reflect the updated selection criteria. We have a letter of interest frequently asked questions document that includes our answers to the most frequently asked questions, and we will update it periodically throughout the open period as we continue to get questions. We developed a new letter of interest checklist, and we recommend going through it before you submit your letter of interest to ensure you've included all the key items and are avoiding the most common mistakes that we saw in 2017. So it's just a quick front and back 2-page item, but hopefully it really kind of keys in on some of the things some of the biggest sort of problems we had when we were evaluating the 2017. As Danusha mentioned, we have a sample financial pro forma. You don't have to use that but if you need a format, if you need some guidance on developing your pro forma, it's really helpful. It's also just helpful to see the type of financial information that we do in our analysis, that we need to do our analysis. We also put together a sample letter of interest, and it is a fictional example, but we created it to help people get a better sense of what we're expecting in a letter of interest. And then I think many of you have already asked, but we will make today's presentation available on our website as soon as we can. So I just want to mention we have 3 more webinars coming up. The ones that are scheduled for next week for April 30th and May 2nd will be really similar to the one that we did today. We did announce a target audience of small communities for April 30th and tribes for May 2nd, but all are welcome at those webinars. There'll be a little bit of extra information for those audiences, but much of the information is the same for all borrowers. The final webinar we'll host for this round is scheduled for May 30th, and it'll be a question and answer session, and we'll have representatives from all the review teams. And we'll start by sharing the common questions that we've received to date, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So it'll be a chance for folks who are working on letters of interest to ask questions. I also just want to let everybody know that we will meet with all interested prospective borrowers prior to a submission of a letter of interest. So if you want to meet with us either on the phone or in person, we can schedule a meeting for up to 1 hour. At these meetings, we can learn about your projects and you can ask us clarifying questions. But just to be clear, this is a competitive process. And we can't provide technical assistance with your letter of interest, and we can't review anything you've written prior to the official submittal. And then once the letter of interest is submitted, we can no longer meet with the prospective borrower who's submitted it, and we can't answer any additional questions. So once letter of interests are submitted, and then again at the deadline point, at that point, because it's a competitive process, we're reviewing your letter of interest based on the information that you've submitted to us, and we won't be coming back to you with follow-up questions. So it looks like we have received quite a few questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Arielle, who's going to help lead us through the question and answer session. And I just want to remind you that you can continue to ask us more questions as the Q&A period goes on.
Okay, so I'm just going to read the questions and then have different colleagues chime in with the answers. So the first one, are federal government entities eligible?
Yeah, so I think I know they weren't on our poll question, but in our eligible entities slide, we did mention that federal government entities are eligible.
And just to reiterate, we're going to make the presentation available. We got several questions about that. For applications, do you have statistics of the ratio of accepted programs?
Yeah, so I can talk about, I mean, we've only gone through this one time. So for the 2017 selection round, we received 43 letters of interest and we invited 12 to apply. At the application phase, which is when the fee comes into play, at this point, we're just starting to close loans from that first round, but our intention is that if you are selected to apply for a WIFIA loan, that we will get you to closing. And so that fee is really just part of that effort to get you to closing. So, and so again, in terms of submitting a letter of interest, there's no fees involved. And we had, for last time, we accepted, I guess, about 25%, but we do have more, we do have additional money available this time.
Okay, the next question. So the high application and credit processing fees have been the main factor deterring our clients from pursuing funding through the WIFIA program. The handbook indicates a portion of the credit processing fee may be waived at the discretion of the WIFIA program. Can you please provide details regarding fees that may be waived and the likelihood of this occurring?
So I think at this point, I guess what I want to say is we're still figuring out exactly what those fees are going to be in terms of the estimates that we've put out publicly. We're starting to go through loan closings now, and we're seeing that generally the credit processing fees that are actually coming to fruition for the loans that we're getting ready to close are less than our original estimates. At this time, we don't have a process for waiving fees.
Okay, I believe that you mentioned there was a $100,000 fee for applying. Is this due before or after the project is selected? So for that one, the fee is due after the project is selected when you submit an application as a selected borrower. If we are not selected, will you let us know why? Yeah, we'll let you know why. We'll let you know why we do a debrief meeting with the borrowers who are not selected for each round. Okay, if a private company has multiple systems across the state for which projects would be compiled under one LOI for the company, can the state regulatory agency provide the public sponsorship?
No. So the project, the public sponsorship needs to be for the affected community. So it needs to be, if you have multiple projects, you would have to have public sponsorships for the community that is impacted by each of the projects.
Okay, next question. Many of the scoring criteria won't be applicable to all projects. Is there some threshold estimated score that it wouldn't make sense to apply?
So I think you're absolutely right. The way the selection criteria are, there's no project that can probably get a perfect score. And we definitely saw that in 2017, that projects that the sort of the highest score was nowhere near the sort of maximum score. And I think that's because many of the selection criteria, as you mentioned, they kind of contradict each other, right? So if you're a rehabilitation project, you're probably not the most, you probably don't have a strong innovation score, or, you may not be a drinking water project, so you're not going to score anything in the project in the selection criteria related to the drinking water contaminants and lead. But I think that's okay. I think that just gets at we're a program that has a really we have a very diverse set of eligible projects, and so the selection criteria kind of reflect that. We don't have a threshold score in terms of your score under which that we will not fund the project. So I think that you just have to put your best foot forward and try to explain yourself in terms of the different selection criteria best you can, and accept that there are some that you won't get any points in, and that's fine.
Okay, we have 2 questions about fees, so I'm just going to combine them. Are fees loan eligible costs, and are you essentially guaranteeing award once you pay the $100,000 fee to apply?
So the 100, you are not guaranteed anything once you do your application fee, but it is EPA's intent to fund the project to get to closing with you. So there is a negotiation process. So you're both in it trying to negotiate the terms of the loan until you can agree on a term sheet and a credit agreement. But our intention in selecting a project is that we've already done enough due diligence on the projects, both in terms of credit and in terms of engineering, to feel comfortable with getting to closing the loan. Oh yeah, the application, both the application fee, all the fees can be rolled into the total project costs and are eligible for, they're eligible costs under WIFIA.
All right, what is the interest rate associated with the loan? Also, is there any grant money associated with the loan?
So the interest rate is set at loan closing, and it's based on the Treasury rate for a similar term. So the interest rate right now is about 3%, but obviously, it varies with loan closing. So it's based on the Treasury slugs rate, and this is only a loan program. WIFIA is exclusively a loan program, so there's no grant money available. And the other thing about interest rates is that all borrowers receive, the interest rate is the same for all borrowers that close on a specific day. So it's not, your interest rate is not dependent on like your rating the way it would be in the bond market.
How do you define an energy production area?
There's not a strict definition for an energy development area, but if you're in a geography that has energy-related work going on, whether it's traditional or non-traditional, you can describe that geographic location when you're responding to that selection criteria.
Is there a definition for economically stressed?
So there really isn't. So that's kind of what I was trying to emphasize, is you need to tell us why your community is economically stressed. I think there are lots of different ways you can show that to us or demonstrate that to us through census data, through information about, there are designations in, states. So I think it's really, with a lot of these selection criteria, but particularly for that one, it's really about you making a compelling case to us and backing it up with data or information that demonstrates that what you say is accurate.
What is the latest a project receiving a WIFIA loan in 2018 can start actual construction?
So there's not a specific limit as to when you can start construction. What we look at is where your project is right now and when you will start the contracting process towards construction. So for a traditional project that's being done via design, bid, build, that would be when you start the bidding process for construction. For an alternative delivery project, it would be when you start the procurement process. So WIFIA can close with loans at a variety of development phases in a project. What we need for you to tell us in your LOI is what is a realistic schedule for the project, where are you in that schedule right now, and when is construction expected to start. And it's part of what we evaluate when we're looking at your LOI.
Do extreme weather events include drought?
Yes, they do.
Are the persons scoring the engineering section engineers?
Yes, we are.
If a project has two technology tracks that are possible, can it be graded under both? Example, can a wastewater treatment plant be graded under conventional treatment such as MBR and also an innovative approach that requires a pilot project? And if the pilot project doesn't pan out, then the project proceeds with the MBR.
Okay, so it sounds like for this project, the technology hasn't quite been decided yet. And so if that's the case, what you can do in your project description is, again, state where you are in your development process and let us know what the approaches that you're evaluating are. And I think if you have a backup plan for an innovative technology, that's a good thing, and you can make a note of that. But in your LOI, what you would want to do is provide a narrative of what your project options are, where you are in the evaluation process, and as you mentioned, what the backup plans are. It is better to be as clear as possible about a project plan as you can be, because when we're evaluating your plan, we'll look at all the costs and schedules included. So if you have two options, it'd be good for you to provide as much information about each option as you could in the LOI.
On the website, it talked about setting up meetings to talk about individual projects prior to submitting a letter of interest. What is the best way to approach verifying that a project is appropriate? Also, beyond the FAQs, is there a way to meet with staff prior to submission to help make sure the application is the best application it can be? So as Karen mentioned in her section, we can meet with prospective borrowers before you submit your letter of interest for clarifying questions. We can't provide technical assistance. In terms of asking about project eligibility, the best way to contact us would just be to email us at wifia@epa.gov. Is there likely to be a next round of the program in 2019 for projects that still may be in very preliminary stages of planning this year?
So the way our program works is we need an appropriation each year in order to open a selection round. So if I know many people on this call are familiar with the state revolving fund, where when loans start to be paid back, that money recirculates and allows the state to loan even more money. Our program isn't like that. So we need an appropriation each year. So it really depends on whether Congress gives us an appropriation in 2019, whether we will have money available in 2019.
Will stormwater projects be considered for the 2018 funding round?
Yeah, they will be.
Does the funding flow through a state SRF program or direct from EPA to the recipient?
So our program is direct through EPA to the recipient. So it's run out of EPA headquarters, and loans are, the loan, all the interactions are with EPA headquarters staff, and the loan goes from EPA. It's really we get money from the Treasury to make the loans.
If you have been selected for an SRF project already, can you still submit for WIFIA?
Yes, you can submit for WIFIA. And just as a tip, if you have been selected for an SRF loan, let us know that you have, and that you have been selected, and submit any of the supporting documents that would be helpful.
All right, so another SRF question. If we can get an SRF loan for the project, is there any benefit in trying to get a WIFIA loan? And what is the benefit versus getting 100% SRF loan?
So if you can get 100% SRF loan, you should get 100% SRF loan. That's really your best option. Most SRF programs have a lower interest rate than we do, and there's the fees are calculated differently. They're kind of combined into the interest rate. So I think for most people, 100% SRF loan is probably the best option. If you can't get 100% with SRF loan, or your SRF is oversubscribed, or the SRF would have to fund your project, you have a large project and it would have to fund divided out over multiple years, and you could come to WIFIA and get all the money at once, then coming to WIFIA might make sense. So we do have a section in our website that explains the benefits and has a benefit fact sheet. But also, if you are kind of trying to figure that out, feel free to reach out to us and ask sort of more specific questions about your project.
For a large community, if a group of projects is submitted, must each individual project exceed $20 million?
So if a group of projects is submitted under one LOI for one WIFIA loan, then each of the individual projects do not need to exceed $20 million. It's just that the combination of the projects would have to be at least $20 million or more.
How does scoring work if you have multiple projects included in the LOI, and one project is, for example, a rehab project of a sewer system, and another is a new infrastructure for clean drinking, and one is neither of these?
So if you are planning, if you have multiple projects that your system needs to accomplish, you can submit multiple projects under one LOI, but there are some considerations that you want to keep in mind. One is that all of the projects in each LOI must serve a common purpose. So for example, say they're all addressing long-term consent decree requirements. That could be a group of projects that was submitted under one LOI. If you're doing a drinking water project and a wastewater collection system project, those would probably have to be two separate LOIs that you submit because they serve different purposes. One of the other things to keep in mind if you're trying to combine projects is that for each LOI and each WIFIA loan, you should have one source of revenue. So in a lot of systems, the drinking water projects are funded via drinking water revenues, and the sewer projects are funded via sewer revenue. So they wouldn't be considered being served by a common security pledge. So they would need to be two separate LOIs. One of the other tips that I'll give you guys is that we can combine projects on our side if you submit multiple LOIs. So if you submit two LOIs and we think those projects actually serve a common purpose and you get selected to submit an application, we can come back to you and ask if you want to combine those projects. So, that's something to keep in mind when you're submitting for multiple projects.
What happens to the funding if some of those invited to apply fall through? Does the next rated prospective borrower become available to apply?
So if some of those that are invited to apply, if they decide not to apply, or if at some point the deal falls apart, we just take the money that was set aside for that and add it in to the next selection round. So we don't really maintain a waiting list where we go down to the next person immediately. We just kind of look at that money, and then we evaluate if there's additional money to be added for a future selection round.
Is this strictly a loan, or is there any principal forgiveness? And what are the typical loan terms?
So this is strictly a loan program, and we don't offer principal forgiveness. However, the WIFIA program does offer a lot of flexibility and a lot of benefits to potential borrowers. So first of these are the long loan term. So the final maturity of the loan can go up to 35 years after substantial completion of the project. So if you have a 5-year construction window, that means the loan could extend up to 40 years. In addition to that, the interest rate is fixed at the time of closing to the slugs rate plus 1 basis point of the corresponding treasury based on the weighted average life of the loan. So these are very competitive rates. And moreover, we offer principal deferral for up to 5 years post substantial completion. And that also opens up the possibility of interest-only periods. And no payments may also be deferred during the construction period of the loan. So overall, there are a lot of flexible terms for WIFIA loans that offer benefits to borrowers.
May we submit 2 letters of interest? Yes, you can. Of the total possible score on the last round, what was the lowest percent of the total for the lowest scoring of the 12 projects that went to the application stage?
So for the 2017 round, we actually approached it a little bit differently, and you can kind of see that in the 2017 NOFA, where we didn't have this exact 300-point system. That was a change that we made this round. So I can't really answer that question because we don't have kind of comparable data.
Does removal of existing assets as part of the renewal effort qualify as WIFIA eligible expenses? Yes. Can costs for early phases of a project be part of the 51%? And what is the earliest date for these costs?
Yes, so the previously incurred costs can be part of the total project costs. And as long as you can show us that the costs are related to the project that's being submitted, it should be okay. If it's within a reasonable period of time between, like, say, 5 years in the past, maybe a little bit more, depending on the project. What I wouldn't include is sort of like if you had costs associated with a larger planning effort for your system in which your project was considered. So if it was part of a master planning effort or something like that, those individual costs wouldn't necessarily be related to the project that you're applying for. But as long as you can identify it as specific to the project, it should be fine.
Can you further discuss the percentage of funding through WIFIA, the 49%, and through experience from last year's applications, what mechanism was primarily used for the balance of the funding?
Yeah, so we had a broad set of choices. So, I mean, some people are using SRF for the 51%, and some people are issuing bonds. Some people are using cash that they had on hand. I think those are the main 3 sources, right? Yeah.
If the SRF has 100% funding and the applicant still wants to use WIFIA instead, can they?
Sure, yeah. It's really up to you and what you think is the best fit for your program.
Have SRF programs applied for WIFIA funding? What states?
Yeah, we had one SRF program apply in the 2017 round, and it was the Indiana Finance Authority, and they were selected. Their loan is still being negotiated right now.
What is the typical time from letter of interest acceptance and negotiated funding agreement?
So I can just talk a little bit about the typical time frame. I mean, we're still a new program, so typical is maybe not the best term, but The way it's worked, we've only closed one loan so far. So we selected projects in July of last year, and we closed our first loan last week. It really depends. After selection, which this time will happen in the fall, it really depends on the prospective borrower themselves, how quickly they get their application in. That's one factor. And then another factor is, sort of the level of negotiation that the borrower wants to undertake. So, I mean, I think some deals are more straightforward, that are lower risk, and don't require a lot of negotiation. Some deals require quite a bit more negotiation. So I think if it's a relatively straightforward deal, it can take, well, what did you ask? From the time of application, which is, really dependent on how quickly you get your application in after you're invited to apply. It can take, 4 to 6 months. But it could also take longer. It really is depend. And we are a new program, and we're going through this, and we're kind of learning where we can speed up, and where we need to take more time. So.
How do you determine length of repayment period?
I'll combine this with another question, which is what is the maximum loan payback term? So as discussed earlier, the maximum loan payback term is 35 years from substantial completion of the project. Now, you can request a shorter loan as well, and the length of the repayment period is usually requested by the borrower in the letter of interest and subsequently the application, and not to exceed that maximum 35 years from substantial completion.
Will we have a better chance of being selected if we meet with you in person prior to submitting the letter of interest? So the selection is completely based on what Karen described, the selection criteria. So we only factor in what you submit to the letter of interest and your supporting documents. But of course, if you feel that it's beneficial to answer questions on your end, then we're happy to meet with you. If my city has never used bonds and therefore has no bond rating, is that an automatic elimination if we have a dedicated repayment source and can demonstrate clear ability to repay?
No, that would not eliminate you. So I think, each situation is different, but you would just need to describe your financial, sort of what your dedicated repayment source is, and you demonstrate your ability to pay.
In addition, I think as part of the application process, you will have to produce a rating letter, a preliminary rating letter, and 2 final rating letters on the WIFIA credit before closing. But for the application phase, you don't need to have a previous rating or to have previously issued bonds in order to apply to submit an LOI.
If an applicant is one you listed as eligible entity, and if that applicant has limited history, less than 3 years of audited financials, would that preclude eligibility for a WIFIA loan?
No. So the eligible entities are, if you are one of those entities, you're eligible. I think, yes, there's no, the 3 years of audited financials are something that if you have them, we'd like to see because it is helpful in doing our analysis, but if they're not available, that's fine.
Does negotiating the term of the loan imply that the interest rate is negotiable?
No, the interest rate is set by our statute, and is not negotiable.
Are previous applications available for review to determine the level of effort for new applicants?
No. So as we said, we have a sample letter of interest that our team put together based on kind of things that we saw that were good in letters of interest from the previous round. So the sample letter of interest can give you, I think, a good sense of what a strong letter of interest would look like, but we can't make publicly available those that were submitted to us.
Can you please provide details regarding the coordination between the WIFIA program and SRF programs? If SRF programs will provide funding for 100% of eligible project costs, will you discuss why WIFIA and SRF funds, when used together, are limited to 80% of project costs?
So we do have a limit of 80% of federal funding on the project, but SRFs are not considered to be federal funds for the purpose of the WIFIA percentage. So there is some federal money in the SRF program, but the SRF is able to provide a loan that is not from that pot of money and is not considered federal funds. So SRF programs can provide 100% of the cost, they could provide 51% of the cost, or you don't need to involve the SRF program at all in your WIFIA loan. So it can be any of those scenarios for your project.
Okay, so that concludes the questions, and we're going to end the webinar. Thank you all so much for attending. I hope it was informative, and please feel free to follow up if you have any other questions that we didn't answer. Thank you. Have a good day.